In my restless dreams, I see that town, Silent Hill. You promised you'd take me there again someday, but you never did.
Hello there once again, friends and enemies. Back in October 2022, Konami did a live stream called the Silent Hill Transmission. This opened us up to 5 new Silent Hill projects, being a movie, a live stream web interactive type game, a remake of Silent Hill 2, and 2 entirely new Silent Hill games, Townfall and F. For horror fans and for Silent Hill fans like myself, this was big. This was our first new announced Silent Hill games since the forlornly canceled Silent Hills back in 2014. And ironically enough, for me specifically, this transmission came while I was in the very middle of playing the main titles of the Silent Hill series. So I thought, why not do a series review? Now I have to clear up that this isn't meant to be a big in-depth review like my Scorn review or the Pokemon review that I posted on the Mediocre Gaming website. This is meant to just be a fun little video where I go off of my feelings of the games in tiny mini reviews. Nothing super crazy comprehensive. I know that those of you that may have seen the Scorn review are here for me doing those pseudo-analysis review videos, but just for this one, at least, it's not going to be like that. I'm going to split this video up into 2 parts. Part 1, this video that you're watching right now, is going to be the first era of Silent Hill, the Silent Hill games that were made in-house at Konami Studios by Team Silent. The next video is going to be second era Silent Hill, the Silent Hill games that were made by other companies and just published by Konami. Being as big a Silent Hill fan as I am, and as I have been since I was a kid, I thought it would be fun to finally go through the entire series back to back to back. And so here we're going to go off of my thoughts and memories about how that game series has gone throughout my past year of play. Just to prepare you, much like the Scorn video, this video and the next one are both going to be unscripted, so I apologize if there are things that I seem to miss or if something doesn't sound quite right. That being said, without further ado, let's jump into the Silent Hill series. Silent Hill 1 follows the story of protagonist Harry Mason, who, after crashing his car, searches the town of Silent Hill for his daughter, Cheryl. While this game was released in 1999, it does a great job, even in 2023, of being a compelling horror classic. Narratively, the story is fine, if not lackluster. The story revolves around Silent Hill's cult known as the Order, and Harry's daughter Cheryl actually being the daughter Alessa of the cult's leader, Dahlia Gillespie. This story sets up the main narrative for a good chunk of the Silent Hill series as a whole, but it doesn't really get touched on as much in this game as it does in other games. The way that Silent Hill 1 tells its story, however, even if it is a little bit tropey, does come off pretty well, in my opinion. Characters in the game are pretty direct and have clear-cut motives for what they're doing, and while the voice acting isn't all that great, the cutscenes of Silent Hill give you a decent time to relax and reflect on what's going on in the game until it throws you back into the horror.
Yeah, a living nightmare.
Let me ask you, have you seen a little girl around here? Short, black hair, 7 years old?
A 7-year-old girl. What, she's your daughter?
And the few cutscenes that add to the horror elements of Silent Hill do so pretty effectively. The uncanniness of the character models in an older game engine really help bring the unnerve and the dread and the unease home through those cutscenes. This is helped by the fact that Silent Hill 1 does a pretty good job of getting the scares out regularly. Environments feel really good, the sound design is great, and everything in Silent Hill feels unnerving. It feels like it's supposed to. It gives you that horror atmosphere that you're looking for when you're playing it. There were times when playing Silent Hill 1 last year where I genuinely got scared. I didn't want to continue to see what happened next because I didn't want to deal with it. Not in a frustrated, I don't want to deal with this type of way, but in a dreaded, I really don't want to see what's going to happen. Aside from that, mechanically speaking, Silent Hill 1 is a fun game. Once you get used to it, movement and combat in Silent Hill 1 feels pretty good, and the fixed camera actually is pretty effective in the first game, in my opinion. The only real problem I had with this game mechanically was melee. Melee in Silent Hill feels bad. Attacks with melee weapons were either too slow for certain enemies or they would hit above an enemy's hitbox, and this may have just been my copy, but it just didn't feel like melee was a viable option in the game. I opted to use firearms instead. Which leads me into the other part of the game that holds this game up really high, which is the decision making. Decisions in Silent Hill 1, as well as the 4 Silent Hill games after it, are not clear-cut decisions that are in your face telling you that you need to make a choice. The way that decisions work in Silent Hill 1 is based on how the player interacts with the game. The game doesn't tell you that there are any choices to be made. At the end of the game, it'll just tell you that because you used too much firearms over melee weapons, or because you picked up an item or didn't pick up an item, or didn't do a specific type of quest, you did not get a specific ending or a specific event to happen in the game. This game design choice is really, really smart, and it's one of the areas that makes the original Silent Hill games so great. Decision-making in Silent Hill is subtle and vague, which is what it should be. Other than that, the puzzles in Silent Hill 1 are fine. They aren't overly complicated and they aren't too easy. The monster design in Silent Hill 1 is simple but effective, and overall Silent Hill 1 is fun. And not just that, but it makes sense when playing this game how this game got so popular and how the series got so popular. Silent Hill 1 incorporates a lot of the good of the Silent Hill series, as well as some of the bad, where in this instance, the good outweighs the bad. Silent Hill 1 is a great, great game, and I feel like if you would like to get into the Silent Hill series, it is a wonderful game to start on. Playing the games in order of release is a really good idea, in my opinion. Silent Hill 1 is an amazing game. It's fun, it's scary, and it does its job well, and it sets the tone for the rest of the series. Whether or not the other games in the series meet that tone is whatever. The game itself is really, really good, and I would definitely recommend it to anybody that was willing to get into the Silent Hill series. Silent Hill 1 for Mediocre Gaming gets an 8.5 out of 10. Silent Hill 2 has us play as James Sunderland, who is visiting Silent Hill to look for his years-dead wife, Mary. Silent Hill 2 improves upon the formula introduced in Silent Hill 1 by having the monsters be a reflection of different parts of James' personality and of his past fears and traumas. Quite a few of the monsters in Silent Hill 2 are designed to have a very kind of sexual look to them, as well as a look of pain and suffocation. The second entry in the series actually takes a step away from the cult storyline introduced in Silent Hill 1 to look at a different storyline about grief and coping mechanisms. This design choice by the development team of Silent Hill 2 would ultimately shape the rest of the Silent Hill series, having most of the games follow this trend of the town reacting to a person and kind of having them confront not only their fears, but also their past traumas. This culminates in a somewhat solemn story about a man who's just trying to look for someone that he knows is dead. And ultimately, in the end, it's revealed that Mary's death is caused by James's wrongdoing. In this development, we get to see a solemn story play out of a man who not only has to deal with the ways that he felt about his wife in life, but also the ways that he feels about himself and the ways that he sees himself and the different types of things that he deals with mentally on a day-to-day basis. Silent Hill 2's storytelling isn't subtle necessarily by any means, and it is a little bit predictable, a little bit more predictable than Silent Hill 1 was, but in a way, this adds to the charm of the game. The way that the story plays out and the way that James interacts with the other characters in Silent Hill 2 really make the world feel a little bit more alive than Silent Hill 1 did.
This town is full of monsters. How can you sit there and eat pizza?
This atmosphere is aided by the fact that the monster design in Silent Hill 2 is actually incredibly good. Monsters feel very distinct and different rather than being kind of just one monster that chases you over and over again with a different skin slapped on. For example, Silent Hill 2 introduces Silent Hill's poster boy, Pyramid Head, or Red Pyramid Thing as it's described in the Silent Hill 2 video game. Pyramid Head's introduction is weird, but it also is interesting. It grips you. It makes you genuinely feel like there's a sense of danger. Seeing Pyramid Head attack other monsters in the world tell you that this is a more dangerous monster than the ones you've seen before. The encounters with Pyramid Head, while few, still happen on a regular, consistent basis, and every single time that you encounter Pyramid Head, he feels dangerous. You do not want to be near him, and you don't want to get caught by him, especially. A rule that I believe should be followed in horror games is to not allow the character to die so easily. When a character dies over and over and over again, that causes more frustration in the player than it does horror and dread. If you make the player feel like they're invincible, if you make the player sit there and think that every monster that they're killing they can just do on a whim, that makes it all the more scary when they find something that is actually a real challenge. And Silent Hill 2, I think, does this pretty perfectly with Pyramid Head himself. The encounters that you get with Pyramid Head aren't necessarily fighting encounters. You aren't necessarily made to fight Pyramid Head most of the time that he's around you. In fact, a lot of the time, if you just wait it out or if you run around until you find the correct place you're supposed to go, Pyramid Head will just leave ultimately, or you'll exit the scene and enter a cutscene moving on to the next area. But the fact that Pyramid Head is this big menacing threat and the other monsters in the Silent Hill 2 world aren't, makes the game that much more scarier when you see Pyramid Head at any given point in time. You know when you hear him coming that it is time to run. And this is going to be a boss monster that's going to try and be replicated by the other Silent Hill games, but not successfully. Aside from that though, Silent Hill 2's atmosphere and world is also helped out by the fact that Silent Hill 2's sound design, much like Silent Hill 1's, is absolutely incredible. The things that you hear in this game really add to the tension and the horror and the scare that you feel when you're walking around this world. Maybe you'll hear whispers coming from some unknown place somewhere near you. Maybe you'll hear someone calling out for you, and when you go back to check, there's nobody there. Things will break or move or something will happen around you, but nothing is actually happening. And the final thing that pulls all of this together to make one giant world of horror is the way in which Silent Hill 2 messes with you. The way in which Silent Hill 2 will make you enter an area thinking a monster will be here, but nothing's there. And maybe you won't see a monster for a while. And maybe sometimes you'll hear a sound that a specific monster will make, but you won't see them. Now obviously in Silent Hill 2 this isn't done to the greatest of its abilities, but it's definitely the strongest of the series to pull this off. This makes the world of Silent Hill feel so much more alive, along with the other non-player characters that you meet throughout the game. And while yes, the dialogue in Silent Hill 2 is still pretty bad, much like Silent Hill 1, all of the characters have pretty solid motivations. They all feel like real people in their own right. Stepping away from the atmosphere of Silent Hill 2, the gameplay feels fantastic. Mechanics definitely feel much more polished than they were in Silent Hill 1, and while melee still feels kind of bad in this game, it does feel noticeably better. Although I do have to say that this was the game where I really started feeling a little bit annoyed about the fixed camera angle. I couldn't find certain areas of a certain map, or I couldn't effectively run in maze areas because of how the camera angle is set up in those places. And while the camera angle in Silent Hill does help with the charm of some of the Silent Hill games, it can definitely be a hindrance, especially when a chase scene is happening. Personally speaking, I have never been a fan of chase scenes in horror games. I think that they're kind of a cheap way to cop out a, scary moment, kind of make you feel scared just because you have to get away. But because of the way that most horror games play out chase scenes, they just come off as frustrating because all you're doing is dying and then restarting the chase over, at least in my experience. Nevertheless, I found this fixed camera in Silent Hill 2 to not be that big of a problem. I was still enjoying everything that was happening and the different camera angles that I was seeing. Puzzles in Silent Hill 2 are a tiny bit more complicated than the puzzles in Silent Hill 1, as far as I remember. Puzzles in Silent Hill 2 feel a little more fun to experience than they do in Silent Hill 1. It definitely feels like in Silent Hill 2 they put a little bit more care into how puzzles are not only presented, but also how they play out in the game. Taking a look at Silent Hill 2 in 2022 and 2023 has really made me realize why this game is considered the best game in the series. Silent Hill 2 is a fantastic entry, and it definitely deserves a lot of the praise that it gets. It is one of the best Silent Hill games out there, and it definitely is one of the games that holds the series on its shoulders. Mediocre Gaming gives Silent Hill 2 an 8.5 out of 10. Silent Hill 3 is unfortunately where a few of my frustrations with the Silent Hill series begin. The game is a continuation of the story started in Silent Hill 1, putting us into the life of 17-year-old Heather Mason, the child that Harry receives in the good ending of Silent Hill 1. Heather has a seemingly pretty good life until she is hunted down by the remnants of the Order and forced to go to Silent Hill to confront them. Narratively speaking, this game isn't anything special, it just continues the cult story that we saw in Silent Hill 1. Overall, I think Silent Hill 3 handles its story better than Silent Hill 1 does. I enjoy a lot of the characters that I meet in Silent Hill 3, and Heather herself is a pretty good protagonist, bringing some of that teenage attitude and angst into the mix. The story is held up by the themes of womanhood and motherhood presented in the game. Some of the more grotesque and wild-looking monsters might wear Heather's clothes, where other more stealthy or more skeevy monsters might represent something that men do to women, or the way that women feel around men. And the way that Silent Hill acts around Heather kind of vaguely alludes to Heather's fears and discomfort of the idea of motherhood, which is the main theme of the game, Heather giving birth to God. Heather is also the first and the only female protagonist in the entirety of the Silent Hill series. Gameplay-wise, the game acts as a conduit between Silent Hill 1 and 2, with the game having that good gameplay feel of Silent Hill 2, but still having some of that bad melee that we felt in Silent Hill 1. Heather's movement feels a little bit better than Harry's and James's. Heather controls really well, although for some reason in my copy of the game I couldn't get blocking or strafing to work. Puzzles in Silent Hill 3 are fine, although some of them can start to get a little cryptic and a little bit frustrating, even on normal difficulty, but overall it's a Silent Hill game and puzzles are going to be puzzles no matter what. Architecture in Silent Hill 3 is where the game really feels a little bit lacking. Maps have very repetitive hallways and can be a little bit confusing. This kind of works at the beginning of the game when you're just in the mall and it works to disorient you and kind of turn you around a bit, but once you hit the subway area, it starts to get a little annoying and a little bit more frustrating. However, later parts of the game, specifically any of the parts in Silent Hill, feel really nice. The main parts of Silent Hill are ripped just directly from Silent Hill 1, which is a pretty nice nostalgia trip, and the new areas like the amusement park feel really, really good to traverse through. The monster design in Silent Hill 3 takes its notes from Silent Hill 2, having monsters reflect different fears or insecurities that Heather has. I think this makes for some pretty neat monster designs and some of the best designed monsters in the entire series, if I say so myself. However, the biggest point of contention I have here is that this game has one of the most annoying enemies I've ever faced in a Silent Hill game. Not all that long into the game, you meet these crawling enemies that, according to the wiki, are called slurpers. These enemies crawl on the ground really fast, and they're usually accompanied by a pretty terrifying noise. There are a couple of things about this enemy that bug me. The first one being that they spawn in mobs, meaning that there are always going to be 2 or more in any given location. The second part is that they usually spawn in hallways, kind of narrow areas where it's kind of hard to get away from them, and they move fast. They generally move faster than Heather. The final part that really bugs me about them, that really got me mostly frustrated during this entire game, is that when they hit you, they knock you down. Maybe it was only my copy of the game, but 90% of the time when I was interacting with these monsters, I would get knocked down. And the knockdown time in Silent Hill feels very bad. It takes a long time before Heather gets back up. And because of the way that melee works in Silent Hill 3, hitting the slurpers isn't an easy task to be done. You either have to shoot them with a firearm or just run away in hopes that you can get away from them fast enough. There are a few other enemies in the game that I found myself being a little bit frustrated by, but slurpers were definitely my worst enemy throughout the entirety of the game. Another monster that's introduced that we never actually get to face as a monster is Valtiel, an angel that the Order worships. Valtiel is usually seen outside of the map somewhere or in cutscenes, and it's a pretty effective character in my opinion. This kind of scary, imposing figure just kind of hangs out on the sidelines, just out of reach, and only interacts with you when the game deems it necessary. This gives the game a fun little air of mystery that only hangs around if you really notice it. Overall, despite my frustrations with the game, Silent Hill 3 is one of the better games of the series. It has a lot of fun little moments and areas in it, it's got cool effects that happen, and while the sound design isn't the greatest, it still feels really nice to have a lot of those noises happening around you when you're playing. It's got some cool, interesting visual effects, and it's got one of the best chase scenes in the series, in my opinion. Much like Silent Hill 1, I was in danger of not finishing Silent Hill 3. Unlike Silent Hill 1, however, I actually didn't finish the game. Similar to Silent Hill 1, I got to the final boss of the game without having enough ammo to take her on completely. Now, while I could actually attack this boss with melee weapons, whereas the boss that I got in Silent Hill 1 I couldn't even get near, this boss is still incredibly hard. I don't have nearly enough health kits in my current save of the game to actually make it through this boss fight alive, unless I were incredibly skilled. I said before that I couldn't get my dodge or my block to work, and that definitely doesn't help at all. And just like in Silent Hill 1, the game lets you know that it is your fault that you made it this far and are having this amount of difficulty. If I had just taken the time to become a little bit more proficient in melee combat, I might have had a better chance of taking the boss on. However, as it stands now, I'm nowhere near that. Originally, this inability to finish the boss fight frustrated me so much that I was going to dock this game points on my final score. However, I felt that that would be disingenuous to my actual feelings on the game. All that being said and wrapped up in a nice little package, I enjoy Silent Hill 3 a lot. I think it's a really fun game, and it's definitely one of the games that you should play if you're wanting to get into the Silent Hill series. Mediocre Gaming gives Silent Hill 3 a 7 out of 10. Silent Hill 4: The Room marks the end of the first era of Silent Hill and also is the most experimental of the first era games. Silent Hill 4 puts us into the haunted little shoes of Henry Townsend, the first protagonist that doesn't actually have a connection to the town itself. Henry lives in South Ashfield Heights, an apartment complex in a town that neighbors Silent Hill. It just so happens that his apartment specifically used to be the apartment of one of the Order members. Being the last of the in-house Konami Silent Hill games, it definitely has a lot of experimental stuff going on. It's got some first-person stuff. It's got the first Silent Hill story where the protagonist's story is not the main focus. It's actually the antagonist's story. Silent Hill 4 introduces a limited inventory system. It has a haunt system that I actually think is pretty fun, and it tries to make some of the aspects of playing the game feel a little bit better. Narratively speaking, Silent Hill 4 is one of the more interesting games of the series. We start off the game as Henry Townsend, who we immediately find out has been locked in his apartment for the last 5 days. Eventually, we discover that a hole has opened up in our bathroom, and we try to leap out of it, leading into the actual meat of the game. From there, we follow the story of Walter Sullivan, an orphan who grew up in Silent Hill who was indoctrinated into the Order cult, later on in his life becoming a serial murderer for cult reasons. At the beginning of the game, as we leave our room as Henry, we are witnessing the startup of these murders happen again, even though Walter Sullivan has been dead for a while now. It really adds this air of mystery as you start meeting some of your neighbors or some people that you've seen around town outside of your room in these segments, and then suddenly they do, in fact, die, most of the time right in front of you. A lot of Walter's story is told to you through these police reports that you find under your door in the room, and after a while outside of the room you start getting cutscenes where you see Walter himself, both as an adult and as a little kid. I really enjoyed Silent Hill 4's story for a couple of different reasons. It definitely held the game up a little bit more than the mechanics of the game did. I thought that getting to see a little bit more of the antagonist's reasoning and personality was kind of fun, although I do wish that we got a little bit, at least a small amount, of reasons for Henry being tied to this, aside from just the fact that he lives in the room that Walter lived in. Mechanically is where I believe this game really lacks. It's important to note that the room is split into 2 halves. The first half of the game where you witness the murders for the first time, and the second half of the game where you go through all of those areas again, encountering the murder victims as ghosts. The split between these 2 halves actually makes the game a little bit more fun, I think, in my opinion. The first half of the game is fairly easy. Every time you go back to the room, your health automatically regenerates. You don't really get hauntings in the first half of the game, and the enemies are kind of easy to blow through. During the second half of the game, enemies get ramped up, and they get ramped up more and more as the second half goes on. You stop getting healed in the room, so all of those healing items that you picked up in the first half of the game that seemed useless at the time suddenly have a purpose, and you better not have used them all while the first half was going on because you needed them for this second half. The second half of the game also completely forces you to think about your inventory ahead of time. I was genuinely a big fan of the mechanics that happened when you were in the actual apartment. I enjoyed the first person. I thought it added to that layer of scary, and the hauntings were genuinely good effects. Sometimes, though, in my copy of the game at least, it was a little bit hard to find out where the hauntings were happening. You use candles in the game to get rid of the hauntings, holy candles, and sometimes, for some reason, I couldn't find the exact spot I needed to place a candle, so I couldn't get rid of a haunt. However, that doesn't take away from the fact that haunts were definitely a fun thing, and the first time that a haunt gets so bad that a ghost appears in your room, that scared me, genuinely. Especially since ghosts make this horrible noise. Speaking of ghosts, they are this game's worst enemy type. Ghosts are introduced into the game fairly early on, and they become a nuisance very quickly, especially once you reach the second half of the game. During the first half of the game, ghosts aren't really that much of a nuisance, but in the second half of the game, ghosts become the worst enemy type in the entire Silent Hill series, at least in my opinion. They cannot be killed, they will follow you no matter what, and they are kind of hard to damage. In-game, there is a mechanic to kind of stop ghosts. You eventually start picking up these swords that you're meant to stick into ghosts when you knock them down. The problem being, at least in my copy of the game, this mechanic didn't work. Knocking a ghost down and selecting a sword in my inventory would not only not work, but it would prompt the ghost to immediately get back up. It didn't matter what length of time this happened in either. Even if I waited until the ghost would naturally get up, or if I did it the very second the ghost touched the ground, it would prompt the ghost to immediately get back up and wouldn't actually work. This was very, very frustrating. Add this to the fact that later on in the game, you start encountering multiple ghosts in an area that you can only knock down for, at least in my copy of the game, only a single second, if even that. It becomes horrendous. It becomes horrendous game design. They aren't the only enemies in the game that I'm not a fan of either. I'm not the biggest fan of Walter when he finally shows up as a ghost in the game in the second half. He kind of just stalks you slowly, but he has a gun that will hit you no matter what. It doesn't matter what you try to do, you can't be missed by the gun, and you can't shield yourself from it either, really. Walter will find you and he will shoot you, and it'll take out a good chunk of your health. I'm also not the biggest fan of the dog-like enemies in this game, but I'm not too angry about them. They're pretty easy to dispatch if you can just get around their little tongue mechanic. Overall, dealing with enemies in Silent Hill 4 isn't all too bad. It's mainly the ghosts that are the problem in game, at least for me. Puzzles in Silent Hill 4 aren't that bad either. Generally, they're pretty easy to figure out. I think movement is fine in Silent Hill 4, but I would change combat just slightly. I think combat feels good in Silent Hill 4, but it's definitely not at a great level, if that makes sense. Sound design in Silent Hill 4 is really hit or miss. Sometimes it's really nice and it evokes that terror you want to feel from a Silent Hill game, and sometimes it is the most annoying thing you could ever deal with. In the apartment level, there is a point in time where a phone starts ringing and you have to find where it is. Unfortunately, the phone sounds the same all the time. There's never a point in time where it sounds muffled. There is no change in how it sounds or how far away it sounds. It always sounds like the phone is right next to you, and it rings constantly until you find out which apartment it's in and hang up the phone. This can be more than annoying unless you've already figured out what apartment the phone is in. If you have no clue, or the clues that they give you aren't enough to make your brain make the connection, you're just running around for however long you're running around with this phone sound going off. It's very repetitive and it becomes a complete annoyance. Taking a step back, at the end of the first part of Silent Hill 4, you witness your direct neighbor, Claire, almost get killed. Then you wake up in a hospital and you have to kind of save her from the hospital. For the rest of the game, at the second half of the game, you are escorting Claire throughout each of the worlds of Silent Hill 4. Your main goal is trying to get Claire to safety, and this entails attempting to not have her take too much damage from monsters while you're going through the world. This can be kind of an annoying task. You can ditch Claire in a room and then go clear out all of the monsters and go back, grab her, and then take her with you. But if Claire takes too much damage, she starts to get possessed and do really weird things that make progressing just slightly more difficult. Not too much. This also affects the ending of the game, but more importantly, it affects the way that you interact with the game during the second half of the game. I think that this is a smart and fun game design choice, but I do think there should have been an easier option of telling Claire to stay behind. The only real way to get rid of Claire in the game without her telling you she's going to stay behind is to get far ahead of her and then leave the area that she's in. She will stay behind and wait for you to come back. This can be a good game mechanic, but it can also be a hindrance if you're trying to get through an area of monsters without attacking them because you've either run out of ways to attack them or you're low on health and she is too far behind you to catch up with you, therefore staying in the room with the monsters. Sometimes when she starts to become possessed, she will just stop, and if you don't want to leave her in the area that she's in, you have to stop with her and wait for her to follow you again. I feel like this could be better implemented if you were able to talk to Claire and tell her to do things. Then she could either ignore you or do something else, or maybe just act weird in response. I feel like that would be a little bit better way to incorporate this mechanic into the game. But Claire being added as an escort also makes all of the frustrating parts of Silent Hill 4 more frustrating because now you have to deal with those with Claire kind of just there. Because ultimately, you cannot leave an area without her. Aside from Claire, other NPCs in the game are generally fine. Sometimes they can be annoying. For example, near the end of the game, when you finally meet the cop character that's been writing the reports that you've been reading, he goes on a 15-minute long dialogue tree about Walter Sullivan and how he needs to die.
You must kill him. You must kill him. Kill. 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 Kill.
It's very repetitive, and there are plenty of points where the game kind of makes you think that the cutscene is over, and then it just keeps going. But other than that, I don't generally have that many annoyances with the NPCs in the game. They're just kind of there. They're just kind of there to move the story along. Most of them don't feel like real characters, at least in my opinion. I feel like Claire feels very good as a character, and I enjoy Walter's character to an extent when he's actually characterized in the game. But other than that, other characters are kind of just non-consequential to you, the player, and more just vehicles to move the story along. That being said, that brings us to my final talking point, the final boss fight with Walter Sullivan. I enjoy this boss fight so much. Walter Sullivan's boss fight is not difficult. It is split into two parts. The first part where you are required to run around to the statues in a room and take swords from them and stab them into this creature in the middle of the room. And then the second part of the fight where you fight Walter himself. Ultimately, you kill him pretty easily. I enjoy this boss fight because it's not a hard boss fight. The other boss fights in the first 3 Silent Hill games haven't necessarily been hard, but they've been more difficult than Silent Hill 4, in my opinion. And the reason that I enjoy this is because it shows you that Walter Sullivan, the man who's been terrorizing people, including yourself, the entire game, the man who has been stalking you and shooting you and dealing so much damage to you, is just a person. He's just a human. He's not a supernatural entity. There's nothing about him that really keeps him alive. He's just a human. And I think this is exemplified perfectly once you kill him and get this final cutscene with him. And as much as I feel like the game's narrative could have been stretched out maybe just a tiny, tiny bit more, I feel like this final piece of clarity in Walter Sullivan's story makes the game whole. It wraps the game up really, really nicely. Ultimately, Silent Hill 4 has its ups and its downs. It can be a very frustrating game, but it is still a Silent Hill game. And if nothing else, I believe it is more than worth at least one playthrough. Mediocre Gaming gives Silent Hill 4: The Room a 5.5 out of 10. And there we have it, the first era of Silent Hill. How do you all feel about these games? Personally speaking, I love them. I feel like they are the crux of the Silent Hill series. They started it, and they started all of the trends that we see throughout the entire game series and throughout the movies that were created. As I said at the beginning, Silent Hill is a big passion of mine. I've been a big fan since I was a little kid playing Silent Hill 3 for the first time on my computer. Thank you so much for watching. Stay tuned for part 2 of this review, and until next time, as always, drink your water.